Hello, welcome to Module 56, Human Disease. So all diseases are categorized as either acute or chronic. So acute means that it's rapidly impairing, so it comes on really fast and rapidly impairs your body. Whereas chronic is kind of ongoing for a long time. So some examples I put up there, heart disease, diabetes would be chronic. So that takes a really long time to take its toll on your body. But Ebola, for example, is very, very quickly. All right, so here's some types of human diseases, and then it kind of breaks it up into infectious. So we've got cardiovascular disease, cancer, respiratory, digestive disease, injuries, maternal, neonatal conditions, other. And then infectious diseases, it breaks it up into what's the most abundant. So respiratory infections are most abundant. And then we have a variety of other things, HIV, AIDS, tuberculosis, malaria. We'll talk about some of these things today. All right, so if we look at low income versus high income countries, low income countries have a lot more things going on. So they have poverty, they can't afford maybe good nutrition, their children are underweight, which leads to malnutrition and just generally not as healthy. Some of those things could be attributed to unsafe drinking water. They don't have clean, safe drinking water, which is the number one killer of humans. So poor sanitation goes right along with unsafe drinking water. So nearly half of children that get pneumonia under the age of 5 die due to poor nutrition. So this would be in our developing countries, our low income countries. Affluence, which means having money, changes the risk for chronic disease because you have better nutrition. So you are better adapt to survive things. You also have medicine. So we tend to have things to combat that. But we have other risk factors, for example, overweight, not doing much, not moving around as much. So we have higher risk factors, for example, in cardiovascular disease than a low income country does. So there's different things that factor in, but in general, low income countries are worse off. All right, so diseases can be either genetic or environmental. So genetic would be that you're born with it, whereas environmental would be because of the environment that you live in. And so in the environment, if we're looking at environmental, there's two types of diseases. There's an epidemic, which could end up turning into a pandemic. So we've experienced that this last year with COVID. So an epidemic is something that causes rapid disease. So this would be something that's acute. And then pandemic is just widespread. So COVID-19 started off as an epidemic, but then once it spread very rapidly, especially worldwide through several countries, then it was considered a pandemic, and it still is. So some examples of diseases, we've got plague. So this would be an acute disease. So it's carried by fleas, which are generally from rats. And so the fleas infect the rats. And then we have got poor sanitation. And so poor sanitation leads to the plague. And the plague is still around today. So it hasn't disappeared. It's just that we have modern medicine now to help prevent massive infection. And we have a lot better sanitation as well. All right, another thing is malaria. Malaria is caused by mosquitoes. So mosquitoes are the vector, meaning that they carry it from one organism to the next. A protist is the thing that actually infects you. And so it spends one part of its life in a mosquito, one part of its life in humans. So the places that we see most widespread would be Africa, Asia, Middle East, Central, South America, generally where we have a lot of mosquitoes. And so in the US, we don't see it as much because we have insecticides. And so we use things to combat mosquitoes. We have good living conditions, so we generally aren't living outside where we can become infected. So things to combat malaria in places that don't have affluence, so don't have a lot of income, they've employed mosquito nets. And so mosquito nets tremendously cut down the amount of mosquitoes that are biting somebody, especially when they're sleeping and they can't shoo them off. So just the simple thing of supplying mosquito nets has done a tremendous job of cutting down malaria. All right. And then in humans, or I mean, in the US population, malaria is mostly found in people that travel. So if you travel to another country, you might develop malaria. It's definitely treatable, especially with modern medicine. We can treat it right away. Tuberculosis is found by bacteria. It affects the lungs. A third of the population on Earth is affected by it. So it's a pretty big disease. And tuberculosis is usually treatable. The disadvantage with this is that in low income countries, they often don't have the medicine to do that. So they are definitely at a disadvantage. But it takes a year long treatment of antibiotics. And so that's a pretty long time to take antibiotics. So the most important thing with taking antibiotics, and I kind of threw this in here at the end, and this is for anything. So this is whether they ask you to take antibiotics for 5 days or whether they ask you to take antibiotics like for tuberculosis for a year. So always finish them. You always feel better fast. So let's say that you have 5 days worth of antibiotics. Um, and after day 3, you feel pretty good. So you're kind of forgetting to take your antibiotics and then you don't finish them off. But you're like, yeah, I'm feel better. So what happens though is we don't kill all of the bacteria. So you feel good enough, and then you just kind of carry on. But you don't kill all the bacteria, and so that bacteria that lives becomes resistant to the antibiotics. So if somebody, let's say somebody gets sick and they aren't as healthy, and they need those antibiotics, like they are not going to survive without them, it might not be as effective for them because they might have strains that um, are resistant to that antibiotics, and that's what we're finding is that people things are becoming more and more resistant to our antibiotics, and if that's the case, that's going to become very deadly. So it's really important to finish all of your antibiotics no matter what, and they do become resistant to that if we don't. All right. And so if we look at emergent infectious diseases, so another one would be COVID. I stuck in here. It's not in your book, but COVID-19 is new. So it's something that's not common. So it could be something that could have occurred a long time ago, or it could be something that's brand new. And so if it hasn't occurred for 20 years or more, then this would be an emergent infectious disease, or like I said, something new. We average about one new infectious disease a year. So sometimes they're not as bad. So sometimes like Ebola was it was very deadly, but it only occurred in a small area. SARS, same thing. It was deadly, but not. It was harder to catch, and so therefore it was harder to spread. So and then West Nile, that's generally treatable. It's an infectious disease, but it's generally treatable with antibiotics. And then HIV/AIDS, that's preventable by not coming in contact with bodily fluids or blood that is infected. And then COVID-19, we all know about that. So widespread travel is making infectious diseases much more communicable. So they're much more traveled around the world. And like I said, we saw that with COVID-19. So that could be for anything. So within 24 hours, something can spread around the world in 24 hours. So with travel, it's making infectious diseases more prevalent, so more dangerous. All right, so HIV/AIDS spreads through sexual contact and blood. 1 million people died in 2016 alone from HIV/AIDS. A lot of it is in Africa, and so there's a very high concentration of people with HIV and AIDS there, and it spread from contact with chimpanzees. So that's kind of where it initially came from, was contact with chimpanzees. All right, so Ebola, 50 to 90% death rate. This is very deadly. This is one of the reasons it comes on very quickly, and it's got a really high mortality rate. So your chances of spreading it aren't that high because it comes on very fast and you get very, very ill. You bleed kind of from the inside, your organs, and the outside. So it's very bad. So you generally don't spread it because you're not traveling around all over the place. Like COVID, for example, you might not even feel that you're sick, but you're spreading it. So this is definitely different. So in this case, fruit bats were the carriers, and so that's where it came, and it spread to primates and humans from fruit bats. And fruit bats are just a carrier; it doesn't affect them like that. It doesn't cause them to become sick. They're just carriers. They're vectors. And then mad cow disease, also called bovine disease. And so what this is, it's kind of disgusting. but it slowly damages the cow's nervous system. It's transmitted by eating meat that's infected. So for humans, if we eat a cow that's been infected, then we can feel neurological effects. So it can make us very sick. What's kind of disgusting, what I mentioned before, is that that's the only way cows can get it. So the only way cows can get it is by eating other cows that are infected. So it's kind of gross to think about because cows are herbivores. They don't eat meat. And they're eating each other. And they're eating each other because that's what they're being fed. So there's definitely regulation against this. This was happening. It really didn't happen in the US. It was overseas. It was in Europe. They were feeding cattle like Roundup parts of cattle and mixed with their food. And so it caused, their muscles to grow a little bit faster because it's a good source of protein. And so that's why they did it. But those cows were infected by mad cow disease. And so the cows were becoming infected. And then if you ate that meat, you were also getting very sick. It wasn't causing neurological damage in humans. It was just causing us to be very sick. And so, like I said, that was mostly in Europe that happened. Swine flu and bird flu. So swine flu, also known as H1N1, which has come up quite a bit when they were talking initially about COVID-19. So it's very similar. But it was transmitted from pigs to humans. A vaccine does prevent it. So H1N1, it's part of the yearly flu vaccine. And so there's occasional outbreaks, but it's similar to the flu. You can get very sick from it, but your chances of survival are pretty good. And then bird flu H5N1. This one wasn't easily transmitted from birds, but it is very deadly. So it's kind of hard to catch, but if it mutates into something that is easily infectious, then they estimate it could kill up to 180 million people. So quite a bit, something to kind of keep our eye on. All right, so SARS and MERS. These are types of coronaviruses, and so they also came up quite a bit when COVID-19 first came out. But SARS has a 10% mortality rate, so it's a little bit higher than COVID-19. And then MERS is very rare. So MERS, only about 400 people have died from that. Both, they're not quite sure where they originated from, but both are a possible animal source. So you can kind of see a trend here. Most of these infectious diseases have come from transmission of animals to humans. So the less we have to deal with animals, the less we are around animals or just doing stuff with them, then the less transmission of infectious diseases, because that's usually where they originate from. And then West Nile, this is transmitted by mosquitoes. And so birds to mosquitoes to humans. It has a low mortality rate with treatment. It can make you very, very sick. You could die from it. But here in the US, very rare because you can get treatment for it. So the prevention is just avoiding mosquitoes. So wearing mosquito spray, mosquito nets, things like that. All right, and then Lyme disease. Lyme disease is from ticks. So the ticks feed on the birds, deer, etc. Then they bite a human, and so the birds and the deer aren't really affected by the disease, but humans are. And so there's about 20 to 30,000 infections in the U.S. a year. It causes neurological damage, arthritis, flu-like symptoms. It can be cured by antibiotics. So once again, if you ever get Lyme disease, make sure you finish your antibiotics so that we don't have any problems in the future with resistant drug or resistant medicine that doesn't work, basically. All right, so Zika virus. This was something that was new a few years back. So it's transmitted by mosquitoes as well, and it causes babies to be born with abnormally, unusually small heads. So very, very small compared to normal. So that also is neurological damage because their brains are much smaller as well. And this was mostly present in Central South America, Africa, and Asia, but transmitted by a mosquito. Your best defense. So best defense for anything, avoid contact with animals, especially if you're like cutting them up for meat or in contact with rare organisms. So you're out in the forest like chimpanzees, just odd things. That's the best thing to do. But anyways, and then also avoiding mosquitoes, just taking bug spray, mosquito netting, things like that. If you do end up getting sick, finishing your medicine. That's super important. Finish all your medicine. And then live a healthy lifestyle so that your chances of getting sick are less. Antibacterial soaps. I want to mention a little thing about this. Antibacterial soaps are bad. They are not good to use. Um, so they're not good because what they do is they don't kill everything. And so we're constantly using these antibacterial things. All it's doing is making the bacteria more resistant. So it's not killing everything. If we were to fully sanitize things, like if you were going to a doctor's office and they fully sanitize, that's different. But the soaps that contain a small amount of antibacterial is really hurting the environment. And it's hurting it because it's making bacteria less resistant, um, or more, I'm sorry, more resistant to medicine. And so it's making superbugs basically out of it. So it's a good idea just to not to use that, not to use antibacterial soap at all. You can use hand sanitizer and things like that right now, especially with COVID, but normally using hand sanitizer all the time is really not a good idea either. You could use the entire, they say 99% effective. They mean 99% effective if you like literally use the whole bottle on your hands at once. That's not very effective. So just keep that in mind in the future. So right now that's fine, but in the future, not a good idea all the time. All right, and that's it. And I will see you guys next time.